What happens when a man trained to stand in silence finally chooses to speak? A royal guard marked by the scars of war and dismissed as nothing more than ceremonial steps onto Oxford's most prestigious debate stage. The audience laughs, assuming he's just there for show, a symbolic gesture to entertain the crowd. But what they don't realize is this guard has carried more than a weapon. He's carried the weight of sacrifice, service, and centuries of tradition, and when he finally speaks, he doesn't need to raise his voice. He dismantles every assumption in the room with calm, deliberate words. By the end, the judges are left stunned, and the once smirking students are completely silent. This is what happens when tradition faces arrogance, and tradition wins. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It helps us see how far these stories truly reach. Now, let's get started. They laughed when the Royal Guard walked onto the stage at Oxford's most prestigious debate tournament. The sound echoed through the centuries-old chamber, bouncing off mahogany panels that had witnessed debates by future prime ministers, Nobel laureates, and world leaders. But those gathered that evening had no idea. They were about to witness something extraordinary, that the Oxford Union debating chamber was packed to capacity. Every seat filled with students in formal attire, their black ties and evening gowns, creating a sea of academic sophistication. The camera glided across the ornate interior, capturing the stained glass windows that filtered the late afternoon light into jeweled patterns on the wooden floor. The moderator, Professor Whitmore, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat with the practiced authority of a man who had presided over countless such events. "For our final speaker," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of tradition, "Corporal Thomas Harrow of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards." A murmur rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Harrow stepped forward in full ceremonial uniform, scarlet tunic, pristine and perfectly pressed, bearskin hat towering above his 6-foot frame, bayonet gleaming at his side. The contrast was stark against the academic robes and casual blazers of his opponents. Someone in the third row stifled a laugh. A phone camera flashed, then another. The sound of muffled giggles began to spread through the chamber like wildfire. What they expected was a statuous silent sentinel who had somehow wandered into the wrong room. What they were about to encounter was a storm that would reshape everything they thought they knew about tradition, intellect, and the power of lived experience. The story of how Thomas Harrow came to stand before Oxford's finest began 6 weeks earlier in the most unlikely of places, the Wellington Barracks mess hall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across scarred wooden tables where generations of guardsmen had shared meals, complaints, and the occasional moment of levity. A notice about the Oxford debate series hung crookedly on a bulletin board, competing for attention with duty rosters and weekend leave requests. Private Lewis, a lanky Yorkshireman with a perpetual smirk, spotted the notice first. He snorted into his tea, causing droplets to scatter across the table. "Debate," he said, loud enough for the entire mess to hear. "What'll you do?" Harrow stand convincingly. The table erupted in laughter, forks clattering against plates, as the soldiers enjoyed what they saw as a moment of pure comedy. Harrow sat at the far end of the table, methodically buttering his toast with the same precision he applied to everything else. The laughter washed over him like water off a duck's back. He had heard worse, much worse, during his early days in the regiment. But something about Lewis's comment struck differently this time. Perhaps it was the way the others joined in so readily, or perhaps it was the memory of his brother's voice echoing in his mind. "Don't let them define you, Tommy, you define yourself." Without a word, Harrow rose from his seat. The room fell silent, as if someone had flipped a switch. Every eye followed him as he walked to the bulletin board, pulled out a pen, and signed his name to the debate series sign-up sheet with a single, precise motion. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before someone cleared their throat and conversations resumed, though in more subdued tones. What none of them knew was that in Harrow's locker, hidden beneath his dress uniform, lay a leather-bound notebook filled with observations, quotes, and carefully crafted arguments. They didn't know about the brother buried in Afghanistan, whose final letter had changed everything. They couldn't have imagined that a man sworn to ceremonial silence had spent years developing so much to say. Later that evening, Harrow returned to his quarters, a small, efficiently organized space that reflected the military precision that governed every aspect of his life. But one corner of the room told a different story. A shelf of dog-eared classics lined the wall. Orwell's 1984, Kipling's poetry, T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, and dozens of others. Each volume was worn from repeated reading, margins filled with meticulous annotations in Harrow's careful handwriting. Notes like memory as moral compass and tradition as collective wisdom peppered the pages. The notebook emerged from beneath his pillow, its leather cover smoothed by years of handling. Harrow opened it to a page marked with a faded photograph of 2 young men in civilian clothes, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at some forgotten joke. The older of the 2 bore a striking resemblance to Harrow, though his eyes held a lightness that seemed foreign to the guardsman's more serious demeanor. For Danny, Harrow had written on the first page, "Who taught me that silence isn't the absence of words, it's the presence of thought." Daniel Harrow had been more than a brother. He had been a mentor, a philosopher, and a dreamer. While Thomas had chosen the disciplined path of military service, Daniel had pursued academia, earning a doctorate in philosophy from Cambridge before joining the army as an officer. He had been the one to introduce Thomas to the great thinkers, to show him that intellectual curiosity and military duty were not mutually exclusive. The letter Danny had written in his final days, dictated to a field medic as he lay dying from shrapnel wounds, had arrived 3 months after his death. In it, he had challenged Thomas to remember that their family's military tradition was not about blind obedience, but about thoughtful service. "You have something to say, little brother," the letter had concluded. "Don't let the uniform become your excuse for silence." The preparation began immediately. While his fellow guardsmen spent their off-duty hours in pubs or watching football, Harrow haunted the barracks library, a cramped space filled with military manuals and historical texts. At 3 a.m., when the rest of the base slept, he could be found poring over Hansard parliamentary transcripts, studying the cadence and structure of great speeches. His fingers traced the words of Churchill's wartime addresses, absorbing the rhythm and power of language wielded with surgical precision. Lieutenant Ashcroft, the regiment's adjutant, discovered him there one night during a routine security check. The young officer leaned in the doorway, watching Harrow scribble notes in his ever-present notebook. "Those Oxford boys eat posh debaters for breakfast," Ashcroft said, his voice carrying a mixture of skepticism and concern. "You really think a soldier's going to Churchill was a soldier first?" Sir Harrow replied, without looking up from his transcript. The simple statement carried weight that made Ashcroft pause. The lieutenant had studied military history at Sandhurst. He knew the connection between combat experience and political insight ran deep through. British history. The days that followed established a routine that would have impressed even the most dedicated academic. Harrow studied TED Talks on a tablet borrowed from the regiment's communications section. Analyzing the techniques of modern orators, he practiced rebuttals while polishing his boots, the familiar motions of maintenance providing a steady rhythm for his thoughts. His notebook filled with observations. Tradition isn't nostalgia, it's memory with discipline. Honor isn't about being right, it's about being accountable. The past isn't a chain, it's a foundation. He reached out to Dr. Margaret Mitchell, his brother's former thesis advisor at Cambridge, who had maintained correspondence with the family after Daniel's death. Over secure email, she provided reading lists and debate strategies. Impressed by Thomas's intellectual hunger and surprised by his sophisticated understanding of philosophical concepts, "Your brother would be proud," she wrote. "You have his mind, but with the discipline he sometimes lacked." The debate topic was announced 2 weeks before the event. "This house believes that tradition is the enemy of progress." The subject couldn't have been more perfect for Harrow's purposes. Touching on themes he had been wrestling with since his brother's death, he threw himself into research with the intensity of a military operation, reading everything from Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France to modern sociological studies on cultural evolution. His fellow guardsmen watched this transformation with a mixture of amusement and bewilderment. Corporal Jenkins, a career soldier with 20 years of service, cornered him in the armory one afternoon. "What's this really about, Thomas Brenz?" he asked, his weathered face showing genuine concern. "It's not like you to seek the spotlight." Harrow looked up from the rifle he was cleaning, his hands never pausing in their methodical work. "It's about Danny," he said simply, "and about proving that thinking and serving aren't opposites." The words hung in the air between them. Jenkins nodded slowly, understanding passing between 2 men who had both seen friends die in foreign lands. "Well then," the older soldier said, make sure you do it right. As the debate date approached, Harrow's reputation within the regiment began to shift. The initial mockery gave way to curiosity, then to something approaching respect. Word spread about his late-night study sessions, his correspondence with Cambridge professors, his growing collection of debate materials. Some of the younger soldiers began asking him questions about history and politics, surprised to discover the depth of knowledge hidden beneath his stoic exterior. The night before the debate, Harrow sat in his quarters, notebook open to a page, covered in his brother's handwriting, quotes from letters Daniel had sent from Afghanistan. One passage stood out. "The enemy thinks our traditions make us rigid. They don't understand that tradition is what makes us flexible. It gives us something to bend without breaking." The day of the debate arrived with typical British weather-grey skies and intermittent drizzle that seemed to match the skeptical mood of Harrow's fellow guardsmen. The bus ride to Oxford was subdued, filled with the nervous energy that precedes any significant challenge. Harrow sat in the back, reviewing his notes one final time, while the other passengers, mostly university students and academic staff, curious glances in his direction. Oxford itself was a revelation. The ancient stones and towering spires created an atmosphere of intellectual gravitas that was both intimidating and inspiring. Harrow had visited the city before, but always as a tourist. Now he was here as a participant, about to engage with some of the brightest minds in the country on their own turf. The Oxford Union building stood like a monument to centuries of debate and discourse. Its Gothic Revival architecture spoke of serious purpose, while the portraits of former speakers, prime ministers, presidents, and Nobel laureates watched from the walls with silent authority. Harrow felt the weight of history as he walked through the corridors, his military bearing drawing stares from students and staff alike. The other debaters were already assembled in the green room, a comfortable space filled with leather chairs and academic memorabilia. Sebastian Lytton, the star of Oxford's debate team, held court in the center of the room, regaling a small audience with anecdotes from previous tournaments. He was everything Harrow was not: tall, elegantly dressed, with the effortless confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege and academic success. "So you're the soldier," Lytton said when Harrow was introduced, his tone carrying just enough condescension to be insulting without being overtly rude. "How refreshing to have someone with practical experience. I imagine you'll bring a unique perspective to the discussion." Harrow nodded politely, recognizing the subtle put-down for what it was. "I hope so, sir," he replied, his voice carrying the measured respect of military protocol. The response seemed to confuse Lytton, who had clearly been expecting either defensiveness or aggression. The debate chamber filled quickly as evening approached. The audience was a mix of students, professors, and curious members of the public, all drawn by the unusual nature of the event. Word had spread through Oxford's academic community about the guardsmen who had challenged the university's best debaters, and the chamber buzzed with anticipation and barely concealed amusement. Professor Whitmore took his position at the moderator's podium, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Tonight's debate," he announced, "addresses a question that has shaped human civilization for millennia. This house believes that tradition is the enemy of progress. Our speakers will examine whether the customs and practices passed down through generations serve as stepping stones to a better future, or as chains that bind us to an inferior past." The rules were explained with academic precision. Each speaker would have 10 minutes for their opening statement, followed by 5 minutes for rebuttals. The audience would then vote on which side had presented the most compelling case. It was a format that favored quick thinking and rhetorical flourish, qualities that seemed to advantage Harrow's opponents. Sebastian Lytton represented the proposition, arguing that tradition was indeed the enemy of progress. His opening statement was a masterclass in academic rhetoric, filled with clever wordplay and carefully crafted arguments. "Tradition," he declared, "is just peer pressure from dead people. It asks us to maintain practices simply because they existed before us, without regard for their current value or relevance." The audience responded with appreciative laughter and scattered applause. Lytton's confidence grew as he warmed to his theme, citing examples from history where traditional practices had held back human advancement. He spoke of the resistance to scientific discoveries, the perpetuation of social inequalities, and the way tradition had been used to justify everything from slavery to the suppression of women's rights. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, a professor of sociology from Cambridge, spoke second for the proposition. Her argument was more measured, but equally devastating. Focusing on the psychological and social mechanisms by which tradition maintained harmful power structures, she presented data on how traditional gender roles limited individual potential and how resistance to change had slowed social progress across cultures. The opposition's first speaker was Dr. Marcus Webb, a historian from Oxford who specialized in medieval studies. He argued that tradition served as a repository of human wisdom, preserving knowledge and values that had been tested across generations. His presentation was scholarly and thoughtful, but lacked the rhetorical fire of his opponents. Professor Sarah Chen, a philosopher from the London School of Economics, followed with a more dynamic defense of tradition. She argued that tradition provided the stable foundation necessary for meaningful change, noting that even revolutionary movements drew on traditional values and practices. Her examples ranged from the American Revolution's appeal to English common law to the civil rights movement's grounding in religious tradition. As the opening statements concluded, the audience seemed to favor the proposition. Lytton's wit and Hartwell's data had been persuasive, while the opposition's arguments felt academic and detached. The murmurs and whispers in the chamber suggested that most expected the final vote to be decisive. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for and dreading. Professor Whitmore cleared his throat and looked directly at Harrow, who had remained motionless throughout the proceedings, his ceremonial uniform a stark reminder of his outsider status. "Corporal Harrow," the professor announced, "your opening statement for the opposition." The chamber fell silent as Harrow rose from his seat. Every eye followed his movement as he walked to the podium, his military bearing unchanged despite the pressure of the moment. The silence stretched as he reached the speaking platform, creating a tension that seemed to press against the walls of the ancient chamber. Slowly, deliberately, Harrow removed his bearskin hat, the towering symbol of his regiment's honor and tradition. He placed it gently on the podium, the gesture somehow more powerful than any words he might have spoken. The audience held its collective breath, unsure what to expect from this unexpected participant in their rarefied world. "My brother died holding a position the Taliban called pointless," Harrow began, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the chamber. His last words were, "Hold the line." For months after his death, I wondered if they were right, if the position was pointless, if the sacrifice was meaningless. But I have come to understand something about traditions and the lines we hold. The room was utterly still. A pen that had been tapping against a notebook fell silent. Even the sound of breathing seemed muted as Harrow continued, his voice building with controlled intensity. "Tradition isn't chains binding us to the past. It's the rope we throw to the next person drowning in the dark. My brother understood this. He died protecting people he'd never met, upholding values he'd never questioned, because he knew that some things are worth preserving, even when their immediate value isn't apparent." Harrow paused, his eyes moving across the audience, making contact with individuals rather than addressing the crowd as a whole. "You quote Darwin but forget that evolution requires something to evolve from. The light bulb needed the candle to show humans the value of artificial light. The tank needed the horse to prove that mobility and protection could be combined. And real progress needs to remember what it cost." He reached up and touched the medals on his chest, the Afghanistan campaign ribbon catching the light from the chamber's chandeliers. "These aren't decorations, they're reminders. They connect me to every guardsman who stood where I stand, faced what I faced, and chose duty over comfort. That's not blind obedience, that's conscious choice informed by the experience of those who came before." The audience was transfixed. This was not the simple-minded soldier they had expected, but a thoughtful advocate for ideas they had dismissed without proper consideration. Harrow's words carried the weight of lived experience, of loss and reflection, of truths earned rather than merely studied. "But here's what tradition really does," Harrow continued, his voice now carrying the rhythm of a practiced orator. "It doesn't prevent change, provides the foundation that makes change possible. The civil rights movement drew on the American tradition of equality under law. The suffragettes appealed to British traditions of fair play and justice. Every great leap forward in human history has been anchored in the traditions that came before." He picked up his bearskin hat, holding it with a reverence that was visible to every person in the chamber. "This hat represents 500 years of service, sacrifice, and honor. It's not a relic, it's a promise that some things are worth defending, that some values transcend the moment we're living in, that some truths are worth preserving. Even when the world around us changes, the emotion in his voice was controlled but unmistakable. My brother's death taught me that tradition isn't about living in the past, it's about carrying the past into the future. It's about understanding that we are not the first generation to face challenges, and we won't be the last. The wisdom of those who came before us isn't always perfect, but it's always valuable. Harrow returned the hat to the podium and looked directly at Sebastian Lytton, who had been watching with growing amazement. You said tradition is peer pressure from dead people, but those dead people include every person who ever fought for justice, who ever stood against tyranny, who ever chose courage over comfort. Their pressure isn't about conformity, it's about accountability. It's about being worthy of the sacrifices they made. The chamber erupted in applause, not the polite acknowledgement that had followed previous speakers, but a sustained ovation that lasted nearly 4 minutes. Students rose from their seats, professors nodded approvingly, and even Sebastian Lytton joined in the clapping, his earlier smirk replaced by something approaching respect. As the applause finally died down, the mood in the chamber had shifted completely. The debate continued with rebuttals and counterarguments, but the intellectual energy now centered on the ideas Harrow had introduced. The conversation had moved beyond academic theory to grapple with fundamental questions about how humans should relate to their history and their future. When the final votes were counted, the opposition had won by a margin that surprised even the moderator. But more importantly, the debate had transformed from an academic exercise into a genuine exploration of ideas that mattered. In the aftermath, as the crowd dispersed and the participants reflected on what they had witnessed, one thing was clear: they had all been changed by the experience of hearing a soldier's perspective on the value of tradition and the meaning of progress. Thomas Harrow had proven that wisdom comes from many sources, and that the most powerful arguments often come from those who have lived the truths they defend.